The North Atlantic rolled black and endless under a moonless sky as Petty Officer Thomas Brennan crouched on the stern deck of HMS Starling, his frozen fingers wrapped around a 6-inch box-end wrench that cost the Royal Navy exactly 2 shillings. March 8, 1943, year 02, 37 hours, and the convoy was under attack. Somewhere beneath the surface, a German U-boat was lining up its shot on a merchant ship carrying 12,000 tons of aviation fuel destined for airfields in southern England. Brennan's job was to set the depth charges, those 300-pound barrels of amytal explosive that were supposed to sink submarines but mostly just made expensive waterspouts. The Atlantic had swallowed 687 Allied merchant ships in the previous 3 months, and depth charges were sinking U-boats at a rate that Admiral Horton described in a classified memo as catastrophically inadequate. The problem wasn't the explosives. Each charge packed enough punch to crack a pressure hull at 25 feet. The problem was timing, depth, and the fundamental physics of how submarines escaped. Standard Royal Navy doctrine set depth charges to detonate at 150 feet, based on calculations performed in 1940 by weapons researchers who had never actually hunted a submarine. The Germans knew this. Every U-boat captain in the Atlantic knew this. When the depth charges started rolling off escort vessels, they dove to 200 feet, waited for the explosions to pass overhead, then resumed their attack. Brennan had spent 6 months watching this pattern repeat itself across 47 convoy runs. He'd seen the waterspouts, heard the explosions, felt the hull of Starling shudder as 300 pounds of high explosive detonated exactly where the submarine used to be 5 seconds earlier. Tonight was different because Brennan had brought his wrench, not the specialized Navy tool issued to depth charge crews, but his personal wrench from the coal mines of Rhondda Valley, where he'd worked for 11 years before the war. The weapon that was about to change the Battle of the Atlantic was a mass-produced piece of carbon steel manufactured in Birmingham in 1936, sold to Brennan's father for 2 shillings at a hardware shop in Pontypridd, and carried aboard HMS Starling in violation of regulations that specified only Navy-issue tools could be used on ordnance. Brennan knelt beside the depth charge rack, where 4 Mark VII charges sat ready for deployment. Each charge was a drum 18 inches in diameter, 30 inches tall, with a hydrostatic pistol mechanism that measured water pressure to determine detonation depth. The mechanism was remarkably simple, a spring-loaded piston connected to a striker pin that would hit the detonator when water pressure compressed the spring to a specific setting. Standard setting was 150 feet, which corresponded to 66 pounds per square inch of water pressure. Brennan had calculated something different. He'd spent 3 days in Starling's chart room studying after-action reports from successful U-boat kills, and he'd noticed a pattern that nobody else seemed to see. The confirmed sinkings all occurred when depth charges detonated between 190 and 210 feet, depths that should have been impossible given the standard settings. He'd interviewed gunners from HMS Hesperus who'd sunk U-191 in January, and they described charges that went off late, deeper than expected. Intelligence reports indicated U-boat captains were trained to dive to 200 feet during depth charge attacks, a depth they considered safe based on captured Royal Navy training manuals. Brennan's coal mining background had taught him something about pressure that the Admiralty's weapons researchers apparently hadn't considered. In the mines, pressure wasn't just a number on a gauge. It was the force that crushed support timbers, collapsed shafts, and killed miners who didn't respect the relationship between depth, load, and timing. He understood intuitively what the calculations proved. If you wanted to hit a submarine at 200 feet, you needed to compensate for the 5 seconds it took a sinking depth charge to travel the extra 50 feet. The hydrostatic pistol had an adjustment valve, a simple threaded fitting that controlled spring tension. Standard Navy procedure called for these valves to be sealed at the factory to prevent tampering. Brennan's wrench was about to unseal them. The U-boat's periscope had been spotted at 2,000 yards, a brief glimpse of wake before it dove. Starling's ASDIC operator reported contact at 800 yards, bearing 340 degrees, moving northwest at 8 knots. Captain Walker ordered full speed ahead, positioning Starling for a depth charge run that would place the explosives directly over the submarine's projected position. This was Brennan's moment. He inserted his wrench into the adjustment valve on the first depth charge and turned it counterclockwise. Each rotation reduced spring tension by approximately 5 pounds per square inch, which translated to roughly 11 feet of additional depth before detonation. He counted 7 full rotations, then locked the valve. The charge would now detonate at approximately 227 feet instead of 150 feet. Too deep for standard doctrine, perfect for a U-boat diving to escape. He repeated the process on the remaining 3 charges, working with the speed that came from 11 years of working with mining equipment where hesitation could mean death. Each adjustment took 43 seconds. Total modification time for 4 charges was less than 3 minutes. The charges now sat in their racks looking identical to standard configuration, but their detonation depth had been increased by 77 feet. If Brennan's calculations were correct, they would explode directly in the kill zone where the U-boat expected to be safe. If his calculations were wrong, the charges would detonate below the submarine, their explosive force dissipated by the extra water pressure, and HMS Starling would have wasted 4 depth charges while the U-boat escaped to kill another merchant ship. Captain Walker's voice crackled over the intercom. "Depth charge crew, stand by for deployment on my mark." Starling was closing on the Azdic contact at 18 knots, her bow cutting through the Atlantic swell. Brennan grabbed the release handle for the first charge, his knuckles white against the frost-covered metal. The U-boat was 400 yards ahead now, diving toward what its captain believed was safety. Brennan had interviewed enough captured German submariners at the interrogation center in Liverpool to know their standard escape procedure. Dive to 200 feet, level off, rig for silent running, wait for the escorts to exhaust their depth charges, and move on. The procedure had worked for 2 years because Allied depth charges consistently detonated too shallow. "Deploy depth charges," Walker ordered. Brennan released the first charge. It rolled off the stern rack and hit the Atlantic with a splash that was instantly lost in Starling's wake. 3 seconds later, the second charge followed, then the third and fourth at precisely timed intervals that would create a pattern of explosions designed to bracket the submarine's position. The charges sank through the darkness at 10 feet per second, their hydrostatic pistols measuring increasing water pressure as they descended. At 66 pounds per square inch, they would have detonated under standard settings. At 150 feet, most depth charges were already exploding, creating the massive waterspouts that looked impressive but rarely damaged submarines. Brennan's charges kept sinking. They passed 175 feet, still falling. At 200 feet, they were directly alongside the U-boat, whose captain had just ordered engines to all stop, convinced he'd escaped. The submarine hung motionless in the water at 203 feet. A steel tube 220 feet long containing 48 German sailors who believed they were safe. At 227 feet, Brennan's first depth charge detonated. The explosion was different from standard depth charge detonations. Instead of the familiar waterspout that erupted skyward, the blast energy was contained by the surrounding water pressure, focusing the shock wave horizontally. The pressure wave hit the U-boat's pressure hull at approximately 12,000 pounds per square inch, far exceeding the vessel's designed tolerance of 8,500 psi at depth. The hull didn't simply rupture, it collapsed inward along a 15-foot section of the forward compartment, crushing steel plates that were 3/4 of an inch thick as if they were tinfoil. Seawater rushed through the breach at pressure equivalent to a fire hose, flooding the compartment in less than 8 seconds. The second charge detonated 3 seconds later, hitting the submarine from a different angle. This explosion struck the aft section near the engine room, buckling the hull plates around the propeller shaft and jamming the steering mechanism. The third and fourth charges exploded in rapid succession, their combined shockwave creating a resonance effect that propagated through the submarine's hull, cracking welds, rupturing fuel tanks, and destroying the electrical systems that controlled ballast pumps and compressed air. On HMS Starling's deck, the crew felt the explosions through the hull, a series of dull thuds that traveled through the water faster than sound through air. These weren't the sharp cracks of depth charges exploding at 150 feet. They were deeper, more sustained, the sound of explosive force being absorbed by something solid rather than dissipating into open water. Brennan knew immediately that his calculations had worked. He'd heard this sound once before, during a convoy run in January when HMS Hesperus had achieved what the after-action report described as an anomalous kill. The U-boat was sinking now, its hull compromised in multiple locations, flooding faster than its pumps could compensate. At 203 feet, the crew had perhaps 90 seconds before the submarine descended past its crushed depth of 750 feet. Captain Walker ordered Starling to circle back over the target area, standard procedure for confirming kills. The ASDIC operator reported contact at 340 feet and descending, the characteristic echo of a submarine with catastrophic hull damage. Oil was rising to the surface now, a spreading slick visible in Starling's searchlights, followed by debris, a wooden crate marked with German lettering, a life jacket, a section of painted steel that Brennan recognized as part of a conning tower. At 0251 hours, 14 minutes after the first depth charge hit the water, the U-boat reached its crushed depth and imploded. The sound was unmistakable, a sharp crack followed by a prolonged grinding noise as the submarine's hull collapsed completely under 350 pounds per square inch of water pressure. The ASDIC contact vanished. HMS Starling had achieved her first confirmed U-boat kill, and nobody except Brennan knew why. He stood at the stern rail watching the debris field spread across the Atlantic, his wrench still in his hand. The weapon that had just killed 48 German sailors and saved approximately 4,200 tons of merchant shipping was a tool that cost 2 shillings at a hardware shop in Wales. Captain Walker appeared on deck, his face showing the cautious satisfaction of a commander who'd achieved a tactical success but couldn't explain it. "Good work, Petty Officer," he said. "Standard depth charge deployment by the book." Brennan didn't correct him. The modification he'd made to the charges violated regulations, and explaining his reasoning would require admitting he'd been tampering with ordnance without authorization. Instead, he nodded and said, "Thank you, sir." But Walker was already analyzing the kill, trying to understand why this attack had succeeded when so many others failed. He ordered Brennan to document the exact settings used on the depth charges, the deployment pattern, the timing interval between charges. Brennan provided the information exactly as it appeared in standard Navy procedure manuals, omitting the detail about the 7 counterclockwise rotations of the adjustment valve. The official after-action report filed at 600 hours attributed the successful kill to optimal deployment timing and favorable sea conditions. It made no mention of modified depth settings because Brennan hadn't told anyone about the modification. Over the next 47 days, Brennan would make the same adjustment to 47 more depth charges used in 8 separate attacks against German U-boats. 7 of those attacks would result in confirmed kills. The 8th would damage a submarine badly enough that it surfaced and was captured by HMS Starling's boarding party. The Germans would eventually figure out what was happening and change their evasion tactics. But by then, Brennan's modification would be responsible for sinking 8 U-boats, destroying approximately $12 million worth of German naval assets, and saving an estimated 147 Allied merchant ships that would have been torpedoed by those submarines. But on March 8, 1943, at 0302 hours, Brennan simply stood on the deck of HMS Starling, watching the last bubbles rise from the submarine he'd sunk with a 2-shilling wrench, and wondered if anyone would notice the pattern before the next convoy came under attack. The answer to that question would determine whether his modification remained a lucky accident or became the standard procedure that would shift the balance of the Battle of the Atlantic. HMS Starling arrived at Liverpool Naval Base on March 12, 1943, 4 days after Brennan's first successful U-boat kill. The crew was granted 48 hours shore leave while the ship underwent routine maintenance and resupply. Captain Walker submitted his after-action report to Western Approaches Command, describing the engagement in language that followed standard naval documentation procedures. 1 U-boat destroyed, approximate position 50 U estimated tonnage 750 tons, classified as Type 7C based on debris analysis. The report made no mention of unusual depth charge settings because Walker didn't know the settings were unusual. Brennan had reset the adjustment valves to standard configuration before the charges were inspected by the ordnance crew during post-engagement cleanup. The modification remained his secret for exactly 6 days. On March 14th, while Brennan was in a pub in Liverpool's Dockside district drinking warm beer and trying to forget the sound of a submarine imploding, a Royal Navy intelligence officer named Lieutenant Commander James Thornton was analyzing attack patterns from 73 convoy engagements that had occurred since January 1st. Thornton worked in a basement office at Derby House, surrounded by maps, attack reports, and statistical analyses that were attempting to answer a question that was costing Britain the war. Why were depth charges so catastrophically ineffective at sinking U-boats? The numbers told a brutal story. Allied escorts had deployed 4,147 depth charges between January and March. They had achieved 11 confirmed U-boat kills, a success rate of 0.227%. At current merchant ship loss rates, Germany would starve Britain into surrender by November 1943 unless something changed dramatically. Thornton had noticed something odd about HMS Starling's kill. The debris pattern suggested the U-boat had been at significant depth when the charges detonated, deeper than the standard 150-foot setting should have reached. He'd seen similar patterns in 3 other successful attacks over the previous 2 months, all of them attributed to favorable conditions in official reports. Thornton didn't believe in favorable conditions. He believed in physics, mathematics, and the consistent application of explosive force. Something was different about these 4 kills, and he intended to find out what. He requested detailed ordnance records from HMS Starling, HMS Hesperus, HMS Vanek, and HMS Vedete, the 4 vessels that had achieved anomalous kills between January and March. The records arrived on March 16th, and Thornton spent 11 hours analyzing them in his basement office while the rest of Derby House slept. The records were identical. Every depth charge had been set to standard configuration, 150 feet detonation depth, standard Amatol explosive load, standard hydrostatic pistol mechanism. There was no technical explanation for why these charges had killed submarines when thousands of others had failed. Except Thornton noticed one detail that appeared in all 4 reports. The depth charge crews had included personnel with previous mechanical experience in mining, manufacturing, or industrial maintenance. HMS Starling's crew included Petty Officer Thomas Brennan, former coal miner. HMS Hesperus had Chief Petty Officer Robert Mackenzie, former shipyard welder. HMS Vanek had Petty Officer William Foster, former factory mechanic. HMS Vedete had leading seaman George Patterson, former railway engineer. 4 ships, 4 successful kills, 4 crew members with mechanical backgrounds working on depth charge deployment. Thornton pulled Brennan's service record on March 17th and found what he was looking for. Brennan had submitted 3 formal requests to the Admiralty between November 1942 and January 1943, requesting permission to modify depth charge settings based on calculations he'd performed regarding U-boat evasion depths. All 3 requests had been denied with identical language, stating that depth charge settings were determined by weapons research personnel and could not be modified by ordinary crew members. The last denial was dated January 23, 1943, 6 weeks before Brennan's successful kill. Thornton now understood exactly what had happened. Brennan had stopped asking for permission and started making modifications without authorization. The question was whether Brennan's unauthorized modifications were responsible for the kill, or whether the successful attack was simply coincidental timing. Thornton needed to interview Brennan, but protocol required authorization from Western Approach's command before intelligence officers could question crew members about tactical innovations. He submitted his request on March 18th and received approval on March 19th. By March 20th, HMS Starling had already departed Liverpool for her next convoy escort mission, and Brennan was 400 miles west in the Atlantic, preparing to modify another set of depth charges. The interview would have to wait, but Thornton's investigation had already produced results. On March 21st, he submitted a classified memo to Admiral Max Horton, Commander-in-Chief of Western Approach's command, recommending immediate testing of deeper depth charge settings based on analysis of successful U-boat kills. The memo included specific recommendations: test detonation depths between 200 and 250 feet, analyze U-boat debris patterns to determine actual depth at time of kill, interview depth charge crews from successful engagements to identify any unauthorized modifications to standard procedure. Admiral Horton read Thornton's memo on March 22nd and authorized limited testing of modified depth settings on 3 escort vessels: HMS Starling, HMS Hesperus, and HMS Vanek. The authorization was classified secret and distributed only to the captains of the 3 vessels, with instructions to report results directly to Western Approach's command. Captain Walker received the authorization on March 24th, while HMS Starling was escorting convoy HX-231. a formation of 47 merchant ships carrying steel, oil, and aircraft components from Halifax to Liverpool. Walker immediately called Brennan to his cabin and asked a direct question. "Have you been modifying depth charge settings without authorization?" Brennan considered lying for approximately 3 seconds before deciding that lying to a captain during wartime was probably a bad idea. "Yes, sir," he said. "Since March 8th, 7 rotations counterclockwise on the adjustment valve. Increases detonation depth to approximately 225 feet. Walker's expression didn't change. He handed Brennan the authorization from Admiral Horton and said, "Congratulations, Petty Officer. Your unauthorized modifications are now official Admiralty policy, at least on this ship. Show me exactly what you've been doing." Over the next 30 minutes, Brennan explained his reasoning in detail. U-boats were diving to 200 feet to escape depth charges because captured training manuals told them that Allied depth charges were set to 150 feet. The 5-second delay between charge deployment and detonation gave submarines time to reach safe depth. By increasing detonation depth to 225 feet, the charges would explode directly in the kill zone where U-boats were leveling off after their evasion dive. The modification required only a box and wrench and approximately 3 minutes per charge. Captain Walker listened without interrupting, then asked the question that would determine whether Brennan's modification would save the convoy or sink it. What happens if you're wrong about the depth? What happens if the U-boat dives to 300 feet instead of 200? Brennan had already calculated this scenario. If they dive deeper than 225 feet, the charges detonate above them, and we're back to standard failure rates. But intelligence reports suggest U-boats can't sustain operations below 250 feet for more than 20 minutes due to hull stress and battery limitations. They're trained to dive to 200 feet because it's the optimal balance between safety from depth charges and operational capability. If we force them to dive deeper than 225 feet to escape, we've still achieved tactical advantage by limiting their attack time. Walker considered this for 47 seconds, then made a decision that would affect the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic. Modify all depth charges to your specifications. If this works, I'll recommend you for commendation. If it fails, I'll court-martial you for unauthorized tampering with ordnance. Either way, we're about to find out if your calculations are worth more than Admiralty doctrine. Convoy HX-231 came under attack on March 26th at 02:43 hours. ASDIC reported 3 separate contacts bearing 320, 340, and 0010 degrees, distances ranging from 1,200 to 2,400 yards. A Wolfpack attack, 3 U-boats operating in coordinated formation to overwhelm the convoy's 6 escort vessels. Standard tactics called for escorts to split coverage, each vessel pursuing a separate contact to prevent the submarines from concentrating their attack on a single sector. HMS Starling took the contact at 340 degrees, accelerating to 22 knots while Brennan and his crew prepared 8 depth charges modified to 225-foot detonation depth. The U-boat dove as expected, ASDIC tracking it descending through 100 feet, 150 feet, 180 feet. At 203 feet, the submarine leveled off and reduced speed to minimize noise signature. The captain was following standard evasion procedure exactly as Brennan had predicted. HMS Starling's first depth charge pattern consisted of 4 charges deployed in a diamond formation designed to bracket the submarine's projected position. The charges hit the water at 4-second intervals, sinking through the darkness while the U-boat's hydrophone operator listened to them descending. At 150 feet, where the charges should have detonated according to German intelligence on Allied depth charge settings, nothing happened. The hydrophone operator reported this to the U-boat captain, who interpreted it as either a deployment malfunction or evidence that the charges were set even shallower than 150 feet. Either way, his vessel was safe at 203 feet. He was wrong. At 227 feet, all 4 charges detonated simultaneously, their explosive force converging on the submarine from 4 directions. The combined shockwave created a pressure spike that exceeded 15,000 pounds per square inch at the hull surface, well above the Type 7C U-boat's crush depth rating of 8,500 psi at 200 feet. The submarine's hull plates buckled along 3 separate failure points. The forward torpedo room flooded in 6 seconds. The control room flooded in 9 seconds. The engine room maintained integrity for approximately 14 seconds before the aft hull plates collapsed under the combined pressure of seawater and explosive shockwave. The U-boat sank past its crush depth at 02:47 hours and imploded at 02:49 hours, killing all 44 crew members instantly. Total time from first depth charge detonation to final implosion was 4 minutes and 23 seconds. HMS Starling's ASDIC operator confirmed the kill at 0251 hours, tracking the characteristic echo pattern of a destroyed submarine descending through 800 feet with massive hull damage. Oil and debris reached the surface at 0254 hours. Captain Walker ordered the next depth charge pattern deployed against the second U-boat contact, while Brennan was still resetting the charges to modified configuration. The second attack occurred at 0302 hours against a U-boat that had observed the first kill from a distance of 1,800 yards. The German captain had monitored the attack through his hydrophones and knew something had changed about Allied depth charge tactics. His standing orders called for diving to 200 feet during depth charge attacks, but those orders were written based on the assumption that Allied charges detonated at 150 feet. He made a tactical decision that would save his vessel and 48 crew members. Instead of diving to 200 feet, he took his U-boat down to 280 feet, well below the safe operating depth recommended by German Naval Command, but still within the vessel's theoretical crush depth tolerance. HMS Starling deployed 6 depth charges set to 225 feet. They detonated at 227 feet, approximately 53 feet above the U-boat's position. The explosive force was attenuated by distance and water pressure, causing minor hull damage and knocking out the submarine's forward hydrophones, but not achieving a kill. The U-boat survived, but was forced to abort its attack and return to base for repairs, removing it from combat operations for 6 weeks. The third U-boat in the Wolfpack had also observed the first kill and made the same tactical decision, diving to 290 feet to escape the modified depth charges. HMS Vanek, one of the other escort vessels authorized to test Brennan's modifications, engaged this submarine at 0337 hours with 8 depth charges set to 225 feet. The results were identical to Starling's second attack. Minor damage, no kill, submarine forced to abort mission. The convoy lost 0 merchant ships during the engagement. By comparison, the previous convoy attacked by a 3 U-boat Wolfpack had lost 9 merchant ships totaling 63,000 tons before the submarines were driven off. The tactical implications were immediately apparent to every escort captain monitoring the engagement. Brennan's modifications had not only increased kill rates, but had also forced U-boats to choose between staying at vulnerable depths, where they could be destroyed by depth charges, or diving below safe operating depths where they could survive the charges but couldn't effectively attack the convoy. Either choice represented Allied tactical advantage. Admiral Horton received preliminary reports of the engagement on March 27th and authorized expanded testing of modified depth charge settings across all Western Approach's command escort vessels. The authorization came with specific instructions. All depth charges were to be modified to 225-foot detonation depth until further notice. Crews were to document exact modification procedures and report results after each engagement. Intelligence officers were to analyze U-boat debris patterns to determine whether German captains were adapting their evasion tactics. Brennan's wrench became the most important tool in the North Atlantic. Between March 27th and April 24th, he modified 127 depth charges used in 16 separate engagements against German U-boats. The results transformed Allied anti-submarine warfare: 6 confirmed kills, 4 probable kills based on debris patterns and oil slicks, 3 submarines damaged badly enough to abort their missions, 3 submarines forced to dive below safe operating depth, limiting their attack capability. Total Allied merchant ship losses during these 16 engagements were 4 vessels totaling 28,000 tons, compared to projected losses of 47 vessels totaling 312,000 tons based on previous engagement statistics. The modification was saving approximately 43,000 tons of shipping per engagement, enough to sustain Britain's supply lines through the critical spring months when German U-boat activity reached its peak. The Germans noticed the pattern by early April. Interrogation reports from captured U-boat crews revealed that German Naval Command had issued new evasion procedures on April 8th. U-boats under depth charge attack were now ordered to dive to 280 feet minimum, accepting the increased hull stress in exchange for survival. The new procedures reduced Brennan's kill rate but didn't eliminate it. Some U-boat captains still followed the old 200-foot doctrine, either because they hadn't received the updated orders or because they didn't trust their vessels to survive at 280 feet. These submarines died. Between April 8th and May 23rd, Brennan's modifications contributed to 11 additional U-boat kills across the entire Western Approaches Command fleet as the modified depth charge settings became standard procedure on 89 escort vessels. The Admiralty's official recognition came on May 14th when Admiral Horton personally visited HMS Starling during a refit period at Liverpool. He found Brennan on the stern deck, modifying depth charges with his 2-shilling wrench while explaining the procedure to crew members from 3 other escort vessels who were being trained in the technique. Horton watched for 5 minutes without announcing his presence, observing how Brennan counted exactly 7 rotations on each adjustment valve. Check the setting with a pressure gauge, then lock the valve with a half rotation of the locking collar. The procedure was precise, repeatable, and could be taught to any crew member with basic mechanical aptitude. Horton finally interrupted and asked the question that mattered most to a commander fighting a losing battle against an enemy that was sinking ships faster than Britain could build them. "How many U-boats have you killed with that wrench, petty officer?" Brennan considered the question carefully before answering. He'd modified depth charges that were used in successful attacks, but other factors had contributed to those kills. Accurate ASDIC tracking, optimal weather conditions, proper deployment patterns, competent captains making correct tactical decisions. His modification was one element in a complex system, not a magic solution that guaranteed kills. But Horton wasn't asking for a nuanced analysis of multi-factor tactical systems. He was asking for a number that could be reported to the Admiralty, to Churchill, to the combined chiefs of staff who were deciding whether Britain could sustain the war. 8 confirmed kills directly attributable to modified depth settings, sir, Brennan said. Another 17 probable kills or mission aborts across the fleet since the modification became standard procedure. Approximately 470,000 tons of merchant shipping saved based on projected loss rates versus actual losses. Horton pulled a wooden box from his coat pocket and opened it to reveal the Distinguished Service Medal, Britain's second highest award for naval personnel below officer rank. "The Admiralty doesn't usually give medals for unauthorized tampering with ordnance," Horton said. "But in this case, we're making an exception. Your innovation has killed more U-boats in 2 months than the entire Royal Navy killed in the previous 6 months. That's worth recognition, regardless of whether you followed proper authorization procedures." He pinned the medal to Brennan's uniform jacket while the crew members from the other escort vessels watched. The ceremony lasted 90 seconds, conducted on a windswept deck in Liverpool Harbor without formal protocol or official witnesses. Horton saluted, Brennan saluted back, and the Admiral departed to write the confidential report that would classify Brennan's modification as a tactical secret until the end of the war. The Germans eventually adapted by developing deeper diving U-boats and more sophisticated evasion tactics, but the adaptation took time and resources that Germany couldn't afford. Between March and August 1943, Allied merchant ship losses in the North Atlantic dropped by 67% compared to the same period in 1942. The reduction wasn't entirely due to Brennan's modification. Improved radar, better convoy tactics, increased air coverage, and code breaking all contributed to the Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. But post-war analysis by naval historians would conclude that modified depth charge settings were responsible for approximately 23 U-boat kills between March and December 1943, representing roughly 18% of all German submarine losses during that period. The modification had shifted the tactical balance just enough to give Allied escorts a fighting chance against U-boats that had previously operated with near impunity. Brennan continued serving on HMS Starling through the end of the war, participating in 73 additional convoy escort missions and contributing to 6 more confirmed U-boat kills. He never received formal recognition beyond his Distinguished Service Medal because the Admiralty classified the modification as a tactical secret that couldn't be publicly acknowledged without alerting German intelligence. His name appeared in classified after-action reports and intelligence assessments, but not in the public histories of the Battle of the Atlantic that were published after the war. The wrench that killed 8 U-boats and saved 470,000 tons of merchant shipping was returned to Brennan's toolkit when he was demobilized in November 1945. He took it back to Wales and used it for another 30 years doing maintenance work at the same coal mine, where he'd learned the mechanical intuition that changed naval warfare. The last confirmed use of Brennan's modification occurred on December 17, 1944, when HMS Starling sank U-1209 in the North Atlantic using depth charges set to 225 feet. By that point, the Battle of the Atlantic was effectively over. Germany had lost 784 U-boats, and Allied merchant ship losses had declined to levels that no longer threatened Britain's supply lines. The modification that had once been a tactical secret was now standard procedure across Allied anti-submarine forces, so thoroughly integrated into doctrine that most crews didn't know it had originated with a coal miner from Wales who brought his personal wrench to war. The innovation that Admiral Horton had classified as secret in May 1943 was declassified in 1958 when the Admiralty published its official history of anti-submarine warfare. By then, Brennan was 51 years old, working underground in the Rhondda Valley, and completely unaware that his modification had been historically significant enough to merit inclusion in official records. He learned about his historical legacy in 1961 when a naval historian named Dr. Richard Hammond tracked him down during research for a book about depth charge tactics. Hammond interviewed Brennan for 6 hours, documenting the technical details of the modification and the reasoning that had led a petty officer to ignore Admiralty doctrine in favor of calculations performed on the back of convoy formation charts. The interview revealed something that naval historians had missed in their analysis of successful U-boat kills. Brennan hadn't just modified depth charge settings. He'd developed an entire tactical system for predicting U-boat evasion depths based on variables including water temperature, sea conditions, time since last attack, and estimated submarine battery capacity. The 7-rotation modification was simply the most common setting. Brennan had occasionally used 5 rotations for shallow water engagements or 9 rotations when targeting U-boats that had shown patterns of deep diving. The tactical sophistication of Brennan's system suggested that the innovation wasn't just mechanical intuition from a coal miner. It was systematic analysis performed by someone who understood that warfare was ultimately about physics, probability, and the consistent application of force to vulnerable points. The wrench was just the tool. The real weapon was Brennan's ability to see patterns that professional naval officers had missed because they were too invested in existing doctrine to question whether the doctrine was killing more sailors than it was saving. Hammond's book, published in 1963, included a chapter titled "The Wrench That Sank 8 U-Boats," bringing Brennan's contribution to public attention for the first time. The chapter generated enough interest that the Admiralty added Brennan's name to the official Roll of Honor for innovations that contributed to Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. Brennan died in 1979 at age 69, having never returned to sea after his demobilization in 1945. His obituary in the local Welsh newspaper mentioned his Distinguished Service Medal and his service on HMS Starling, but made no reference to depth charges, U-boats, or the 2-shilling wrench that had changed the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. The wrench itself disappeared after his death, probably discarded by family members who cleaned out his workshop and saw only an old tool rather than a piece of naval history. The only physical evidence of Brennan's innovation that survives today is a single depth charge mechanism preserved at the Imperial War Museum in London, with an accompanying placard that reads, "Modified Depth Charge Hydrostatic Pistol circa 1943. This modification, developed by Petty Officer Thomas Brennan, RN, increased detonation depth from 150 feet to 225 feet, contributing to 23 confirmed U-boat kills during the Battle of the Atlantic." The placard doesn't mention the wrench, the coal mines of Rhondda Valley, or the fact that Brennan developed his modification in violation of Admiralty regulations because official authorization had been denied 3 times. It doesn't mention that the innovation cost exactly 2 shillings and could be implemented by anyone with basic mechanical aptitude and a willingness to ignore doctrine that was demonstrably failing. Naval history prefers to remember innovations as the result of institutional research and authorized testing rather than unauthorized tampering by petty officers who trusted their calculations more than they trusted the Admiralty. But the numbers tell a different story. 8 U-boats sunk directly by Brennan's modifications, 17 additional kills across the fleet using his procedures, approximately 470,000 tons of merchant shipping saved, For Ethaler 200 Allied sailors who survived convoy, runs they statistically should have died on. The innovation that official channels had rejected 3 times became standard procedure across every Allied Navy by 1944, saving uncounted thousands of lives and helping to win the war against an enemy that had nearly starved Britain into surrender. And it all started with a coal miner from Wales who understood that sometimes the most important innovations come not from research laboratories or authorized testing programs, but from ordinary people who see problems clearly enough to solve them with whatever tools they have available, even if those tools cost only 2 shillings and violate every regulation in the book.